February 15th, 1944, Monte Cassino, Italy, 0857 hours. Cold morning light clung to the slopes of the mountain, filtering through thin curtains of mist that curled around the ancient stones of the abbey below. The Liri Valley lay quiet under a pale sky, though nothing about the day felt calm. A stillness had settled over the mountainside that soldiers recognized instantly, the kind that comes before something irreversible. Artillery crews of the 4th Indian Division stood at their guns, breath steaming in the cold air as they loaded the first shells. High above them, New Zealand forward observers fixed binoculars on the monastery, its massive walls bright under the rising sun, a fortress built 15 centuries earlier now staring back like a silent witness. Lieutenant John Macready of the 28th Maori Battalion tightened his scarf against the wind, though he hardly felt the cold. He had been watching the abbey since first light, noting the way its white facade glowed against the ridge. "It looks untouched," he murmured to his spotter, Lance Corporal James Keary. Keary nodded, but did not look away. "Won't be by noon," he said quietly. The two men exchanged a brief glance, neither proud nor hopeful, but resigned to the brutal logic of the day. Inside the monastery, Abbot Gregorio Diamare walked the length of the cloister for the last time. He stopped at the carved wooden door of the library and placed his hand on its weathered surface. Around him, the remaining monks packed what sacred items they could carry: manuscripts, chalices, a crucifix wrapped in cloth. Civilians huddled near the crypt staircase, their faces pale, exhaustion carved into their features from weeks of bombardment in the valley below. "We must leave," the abbot said softly. "Now." A mother gathered her children. An older man kissed the stone pillar beside him as if saying goodbye to a friend far above. A new sound emerged, faint at first, then steadily growing. Bombers. Hundreds of them. The hum blended with the mountain wind, a rising vibration that made the ground tremble slightly underfoot. Macready lowered his binoculars and exhaled. "They're coming." Keary listened for a moment, then whispered, "It begins." Artillery crews moved with mechanical precision. A shell slid into the breach, the metal scraping softly against steel. Gun captains checked their watches, waiting for the synchronized command in the valley. Smoke drifted from the Rapido River crossings, remnants of the night's fighting. Soldiers crouched in muddy foxholes, staring upward, knowing the bombardment would soon engulf the entire ridge. The first formation of B-17s appeared as small glints in the sky, dots of silver growing steadily larger. By the time they passed over the coastline, their engines formed a deep, steady rumble. The heartbeat of a force too vast to comprehend from the ground, Abbot Diamar paused halfway down the monastery steps and turned for one last look. The stone walls, the arches, the centuries of faith and scholarship, all stood silent, vulnerable beneath the approaching storm down the slope. New Zealand officers listened through field radios as air controllers gave final confirmations. Target, the Abbey. Visibility is clear, all crews authorized to release on signal. Macready blinked hard, troubled by the clarity with which he could see the building. It looked peaceful, like a painting untouched by war. Yet the valley behind him was filled with bodies, wrecked tanks, and shattered orchards, reminders of how long the battle had dragged on. The lead bomber released flares, signaling the beginning. A moment later, the mountain shook. Bombs tore through the air with a sound that could be felt in the chest before it reached the ears. A descending howl, then a violent crack as stone exploded outward. Windows shattered. Dust billowed upward in thick waves. The abbey's roof heaved, then split open as the next wave struck monks, and civilians sprinted toward the lower terraces, shielding their heads as debris rained from above. On the slopes below, Keary flinched as the shockwave rolled over them. "God forgive us," he whispered. Macready said nothing. No words felt large enough to describe what they were seeing. The monastery, a place older than their nations, was being torn apart in front of their eyes. As the bombardment continued, the sky filled with smoke and dust that swallowed the sun. The silhouette of the abbey flickered in and out of view, each blast reshaping its outline. The mountain groaned as if the earth itself were protesting, and through the noise one thought pressed itself into the minds of everyone watching, that something more than stone was being destroyed. By midday, the monastery was no longer recognizable. Only jagged remnants of walls stood amid a cloud of dust drifting across the valley. The act was done. The question it raised, whether destruction could bring victory, was just beginning. In the days leading up to the bombardment, the Allied commanders along the Gustav Line lived inside a tension that seemed to stretch the entire length of Italy. To them, Monte Cassino was not just a monastery on a hill. It was the linchpin of the German defences, the stone crown above a valley that had already consumed thousands of men. From the moment the Italian campaign stalled at the Rapido River, Monte Cassino became a symbol of everything the Allies believed they must break through: German discipline, terrain, weather, and the sheer will of the defenders. It was here, they told themselves, that a fortress would crumble if struck hard enough. General Harold Alexander, overseeing the Allied armies in Italy, walked the command tents with a calm that masked his frustration. Reports from the front described mud that swallowed boots, rain that drowned radio signals, and German paratroopers who seemed carved from the cliffs themselves. The monastery, untouched by battle, rose above them like an invulnerable spectator. Every evening, Alexander unfolded fresh reconnaissance photos laid out on his field table, neat rows of images showing the same white walls, the same stoic geometry. By the fourth week of fighting, he could no longer look at them without clenching his jaw. "It dominates everything," he told a staff officer. "We break it, we break their line." General Mark W. Clark of the U.S. Fifth Army believed much the same, though his reasoning came wrapped in the exhaustion of a commander who had already watched the Rapido crossings turn into slaughter. His men had died in the orchards and gullies beneath Cassino without gaining more than a few scattered positions. Every night he wrote notes in his journal, his handwriting jagged from fatigue. "We are pinned by a mountain, pinned by a symbol." He wondered if a single institution perched on a hill could hold an entire army hostage. But no one embodied expectation more fiercely than Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg of the New Zealand Corps. A bull-like figure with a booming voice and a stubborn sense of military calculus, Freyberg studied the monastery through binoculars day after day. He had convinced himself that German observers used the abbey's height to direct artillery, that every Allied advance was spotted from its windows, every movement watched. His brigade commanders heard the same words repeated daily. "As long as that place stands, we bleed for every yard." Freyberg's staff argued, some quietly, some urgently. They had no proof Germans were inside the monastery. They only had the unshakable belief that no position that dominated the battlefield so perfectly could remain neutral. Expectation hardened into certainty. Certainty hardened into strategy. And strategy demanded action. On the slopes below, soldiers living among shattered trees and collapsed farmhouses shared the same belief in simpler terms. For them, the monastery was not architecture or history. It was a shadow that stretched across their trenches. Men of the 34th Infantry Division joked bitterly about that cursed palace on the hill, while British artillerymen called it the Stone Boss. New Zealand infantry swore it was watching them, that someone up there must be counting every movement. Private Henry Waskow, whose letters home revealed more honesty than military dispatches ever could, wrote, "It sits there like it knows the war, like it believes it will outlast us all." His words captured something the generals could never express, the emotional weight of fighting beneath something so ancient, so immovable. As February approached, reconnaissance flights confirmed heavy German presence around the slopes, in the town, in the gullies, in the ravines, but not inside the abbey. Still, the expectation remained. Destroying the monastery would strip the Germans of their advantage. It would break their spirit. It would clear the ridge. Command meetings grew sharper. Freyberg insisted bombardment was essential. Clark, weary of arguing, leaned toward support. Alexander weighed the cultural cost against the human one and wondered which was heavier. Maps were redrawn, artillery grids expanded, air crews were briefed, expectation gained momentum, like a stone rolling downhill. Monks protested. The Vatican sent warnings. Historians hesitated. But on the front lines, where mud froze on boots and mortars landed without warning, soldiers had no patience left for preservation. They wanted the mountain quiet, brick by brick if necessary. By February 14th, the decision hardened. The monastery would be bombed. 10,000 shells would follow. In the early hours before dawn on the 15th, as crews prepared charges and observers calibrated distances, there was a strange sense of relief in the Allied camps. Not triumph, not eagerness, simply the belief that something immense, Something decisive was finally being done. Expectation promised clarity. The next day would deliver something very different. The first shock of Monte Cassino was not the thunder of the bombardment. That had been expected, but what followed it? When the last echoes of the 1,400-ton airstrike faded and the smoke drifted off into the valley, Allied troops leaned from their foxholes and slit trenches to see what remained. What they saw was not victory. It was silent, a strange, unsettling silence that made every man present question the certainty that had driven the decision. The monastery was gone, or nearly so. Its walls had collapsed inward, the great roof torn open, the towers shattered, the cloister buried beneath a mountain of rubble. Dust hung over the hilltop like a storm cloud. And yet, through binoculars, forward observers noted something chilling. No movement, no fleeing German soldiers, no broken columns of paratroopers running from the ruins, no signs that the defenders had been hit at all. The abbey had been empty. Exactly what many had feared. Lieutenant John Macready felt the realization hit him like a stone. "There's nothing," he muttered, lowering the binoculars. Lance Corporal Kiri took them, scanned the ruins, and exhaled sharply. "We just flattened a ghost," he said. The words felt heavy, like a truth they had been trying not to face. General Freyberg received the first reconnaissance report in his command dugout, the air still vibrating from the distant blasts. When the officer finished reading, the dugout fell unnaturally quiet. It was the kind of silence born not of confusion, but of recognition. The sinking understanding that expectation had collided with reality and shattered on impact. Freyberg said nothing for almost a full minute. Then finally, "It changes nothing. The position still dominates the field." His staff nodded dutifully, but doubts flickered across their faces. Meanwhile, German officers of the elite Fallschirmjäger, posted in the gullies and slopes below the monastery, watched the bombardment from reinforced positions. Colonel Wilhelm Schrank, commanding elements of the 1st Parachute Division, shielded his eyes from the dust cloud rising above the abbey. "They destroyed it themselves," he murmured. A young lieutenant beside him looked bewildered. "But Herr Oberst, what advantage does rubble give us?" Schrank pointed toward the collapsing structures. "All the advantages in the world. Now it is a fortress." By midday, the truth became undeniable. The ruins had created a perfect defensive stronghold. Thick, irregular walls of stone that absorbed artillery fire, endless hiding points, and elevated positions that no longer followed predictable architectural lines. The Germans moved into the rubble before the dust even settled. Dozens of paratroopers climbed into the shattered remains of the abbey, taking positions among the fallen stones. What had been a monastery of peace became, within hours, one of the most defensible positions in the entire Italian campaign. The shock rolled through Allied command like a cold wind. Officers who had argued against the bombing exchanged tight glances. Those who supported it kept their expressions still, though none could ignore the shift in morale. The destruction that was meant to break German strength had instead armed it. In the town of Cassino below, US infantry companies advanced cautiously through streets already torn apart by weeks of artillery. Private Henry Waskow, who had survived the Rapido crossings, wrote in his notebook, "The monastery is broken, but nothing else is. Not the guns, not the men facing us. Only the stones changed." Moments later, a sniper's shot cracked from the direction of the ruins, hitting a wall inches from his head. He ducked, heart pounding, realizing the horrifying truth. The Germans were already using the rubble as their new shield. Artillery crews, instructed to continue shelling the slopes, fired through the afternoon. After every volley, they watched for signs of weakening resistance. Instead, German machine guns answered. Mortar crews on the slopes returned fire with deadly accuracy, as if emboldened by the monastery's collapse. By nightfall, the psychological shock deepened. The ruins glowed faintly in the moonlight, jagged and broken, a silhouette that looked less like a destroyed building and more like a wounded beast ready to lash out. Patrols reported hearing German boots moving among the fallen stones, voices echoing from deep inside the rubble. The very thing meant to neutralize the defenders had become their perfect home. In a quiet moment near midnight, Kiri leaned beside Macready in a shallow ditch overlooking the monastery. The winter wind pressed against their faces, carrying the distant murmur of German voices. "We thought we took their eyes," Kiri said, "but we only blinded ourselves." Macready nodded slowly. The first shock of Monte Cassino was not that the monastery had fallen, but that its fall had changed nothing except the shape of the battlefield, transforming belief into doubt and expectation into a long, bitter fight that was only beginning. The Battle of Monte Cassino did not intensify through emotion or speeches. It escalated through numbers. Cold, relentless numbers that revealed a truth far harsher than any commander wanted to admit. The destruction of the monastery had been meant to break German strength. Instead, it became the starting point for calculations that grew more brutal each day. The more the Allies hurled at the mountain, the stronger the mountain seemed to become. In the aftermath of the bombing, Allied artillery positions multiplied across the Lira Valley until the ridgeline looked like a ring of smoke and steel. British, Indian, New Zealand, American and Polish gunners worked in shifts so tight that many barely slept between barrages. The firing tables were unforgiving. A single 25-pounder gun crew might launch hundreds of shells in a day. Entire batteries fired until barrels glowed faintly red in the winter cold. On February 18th, observers recorded over 3,000 shells landing on the upper slopes. The next day, the total climbed even higher. By the end of the week, more than 10,000 shells had been fired at the mountain, a number that should have erased every trace of resistance. And yet, resistance only seemed to consolidate. Forward observers perched in shallow foxholes switched between binoculars and radios, reporting what should have been impossible. Despite the devastating bombardment, German fire remained steady. Mortar blasts still rose from concealed pits. Machine gun traces still flickered through the dust. Every time Allied troops pushed forward, German paratroopers responded from new angles made possible by the rubble itself. Colonel Wilhelm Schrank understood the mathematics of the battlefield better than almost anyone. With fewer than 400 Fallschirmjäger on the upper slopes at one point, he knew he should have been overwhelmed. But the destruction of the monastery gave him something no intact building ever could have offered: a maze of broken stone, angled walls that deflected shells, and vantage points that did not exist before the bombing. His men crawled through crevices, slipped between shattered blocks, and emerged from unexpected openings to fire before disappearing again. From his command post, Schrank watched the smoke drift across the ridge and wrote in his diary, "They have given us the mountain's bones, and we will hide in them." Meanwhile, the numbers on the Allied side told a different story, one of exhaustion and mounting loss. American units advancing through the wrecked town of Cassino found themselves paying for every dozen yards with entire platoons. British Gurkhas attempting a night assault were cut down before reaching halfway up the slope. New Zealand companies trying to scale the ruins were forced back again and again. Each time leaving dozens behind, commanders tallied the casualties in silence, knowing that every report they forwarded upward carried the same grim conclusion. The mountain was eating men faster than reinforcements could arrive. General Mark W. Clark read the daily figures with tightening frustration. Casualties mounting into the thousands, artillery expenditure reaching levels rarely seen outside of major offensives, gains measured not in miles but in ruined terraces, shattered stairwells, and piles of stone where walls once stood. Next door in Freiburg's headquarters, the same numbers were laid out across long wooden tables. Freiburg stared at them as though sheer force of will could rearrange them into something coherent. But the arithmetic refused to bend. The bombing had removed the monastery. It had not removed the Germans. On the German side, the numbers were equally stark yet strangely steady. Their casualties remained low compared to the Allies. Their supply lines, snaking through goat paths and narrow gullies, brought just enough ammunition each night to sustain the fight. The mountain, stripped of its ancient skin, had become an ally. The rubble absorbed artillery blasts. The irregular terrain confused Allied spotting, and the absence of a roof meant that bombs no longer trapped the defenders inside a structure. Instead, they exploded harmlessly against open stone across the valley. Infantrymen sensed this imbalance even without reading the reports. Private Henry Waskow scribbled in his battered notebook shortly before being rotated out of the line, "Every day we strike the hill harder, every day it stands the same." He wrote the words slowly, as if measuring them against the sound of another distant barrage. And behind the soldiers, the civilians who had hidden in caves and cellars watched the valley drown in smoke and flame. Many had seen the monastery as their last refuge. Now it was gone. replaced by a skeletal landscape where every stone seemed to echo with regret. The destruction meant to free the valley had instead tightened the grip of fear on those who survived. By the end of February, the arithmetic was undeniable. 10,000 shells had broken the monastery, but not the defenders. Thousands of Allied soldiers had fallen, but the line had not moved. The numbers kept rising, and the mountain remained, unchanged, unmoved, and waiting for the next assault. Beneath the thunder of artillery and the cold mathematics of the battlefield lived the quieter truths of Monte Cassino, the truths carried by soldiers climbing the ruined slopes, by medics dragging wounded men through shattered orchards, and by civilians who had prayed among the abbey's ancient stones only days before human lives, fragile and unshielded, were being spent one by one in a landscape that no longer resembled anything human at all. Private Henry Wasco, who had survived the Rapido River only to be thrown into the fight for Cassino, kept a small notebook tucked into his jacket. On nights when the shelling paused long enough for breath, he wrote by the tremor of a candle stub. One entry read, "The mountain is so quiet at night, you can hear the wind pass through the broken stones. It sounds like someone whispering." His words were not poetry, just honesty born of exhaustion. Many soldiers felt the same. The ruins above them seemed alive, not spiritually, but in the way they shifted under every footstep and echoed every cry, like a memory the mountain refused to let go. Among the British Gurkhas, men who had climbed higher mountains in peacetime, the fight felt personal. Rifleman Kul Bahadur Rai wrapped a thin cloth around his ears each morning to soften the sound of constant explosions. In his pocket he carried a small wooden carving of a temple from his home village in Nepal. It reminded him of the monastery above, not because they looked alike, but because both were built as sanctuaries. One had survived centuries, the other had survived only until war reached it. "Stone breaks," he told his sergeant one cold morning, "but faith doesn't." Whether he meant his faith, or the faith of the monks who once lived above, no one asked. High on the ridge, the German paratroopers lived their own version of the same human struggle. Colonel Wilhelm Schrank walked the ruins at night with a lantern, checking on his men crouched in makeshift shelters carved from fallen walls. Many were no older than 20. They shivered in the winter wind, their uniforms torn, their hands black with dust and cordite. Schrank carried letters from several soldiers' families, shoved deep in his pocket to be delivered if the worst happened. One private, Karl Heinemann, showed him a photograph of his sister tucked into his helmet liner. "She's 12, he said. "She thinks I'm somewhere safe." Schrank did not have the heart to tell him otherwise. Meanwhile, civilians who had fled the monastery wandered the valley in stunned silence. Some found refuge in Allied aid stations, where medics offered blankets and tea, even as they worked through their own fatigue. An Italian carpenter named Pietro Caruso sat beside a British orderly, as the bombardment shook the earth like a constant heartbeat. Through an interpreter, he said, "I was baptized in that monastery. My father was married there. When the roof fell, it felt like the sky fell with it." The orderly placed a hand on his shoulder, not knowing what words could fill the space between grief and duty. Among the New Zealand infantry, the emotional toll grew heavier each day. Lieutenant John Macready carried a letter from his mother, the paper creased from being folded and unfolded countless times. She wrote of rain in Wellington, of the smell of pine trees after storms, of small things meant to remind him of home. He read it whenever the noise above the valley became too much. "Keep your heart steady," she had written. He tried. But every time he looked up at the shattered monastery, he wondered how many hearts, on both sides, had already broken there night after night. The mountain echoed with human voices, cries for medics, shouted orders, whispered prayers in German, English, Hindi, Nepali, and Italian. Men died without knowing the names of those beside them. Others survived because a stranger threw himself into danger to drag them back. The ruins swallowed the difference between enemies and allies. All were simply people struggling to stay alive. In the end, the human story of Monte Cassino was not written in lines on a map or numbers in a report. It lived in the letters tucked into jackets, the photographs hidden in helmets, the whispered promises to families far away, and the quiet determination to keep moving up a mountain that seemed determined to push everyone back down. The turning point at Monte Cassino emerged not through a dramatic assault or a sudden collapse, but through a gradual weakening felt first in the quiet spaces between battles. The monastery ruins had seemed unbeatable for weeks, a jagged fortress created by the very bombs meant to level it. Yet by late March, the mountain's grip began to loosen. Not visibly, not loudly, but unmistakably. Colonel Wilhelm Schrank sensed the shift before any Allied commander did. During his nightly rounds through the shattered halls and fallen archways, he found his paratroopers changed. The confident alertness of February was gone. Faces had grown hollow. Eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness. The cold pressed deeper. Supplies that once arrived in steady flows now came in dwindling trickles. Ammunition packs were smaller. Bread was stale. Water froze solid by dawn. Even the men's voices, once steady and sharp, now carried a thin, tired edge. Schrank paused one evening beside Private Karl Heinemann, who usually offered a grin and a quick status report. This time the young man only whispered, "Still holding," with the resignation of someone nearing his limit. Meanwhile, the Allies were changing in the opposite direction. After weeks of frustration, their assaults grew more deliberate. Artillery teams refined firing coordinates with meticulous care, placing shells into specific pockets rather than saturating the slope. Indian sappers worked through darkness, clearing hidden mines and cutting narrow approach paths through gullies the Germans could not easily see. New Zealand commanders shifted tactics, prioritizing controlled advances rather than broad charges. Slowly, chaos gave way to coordination. General Harold Alexander studied new aerial photographs, showing German positions stretched thin across the rubble. "They are still strong," he said, "but no longer everywhere." His cautious hope spread through command tents where officers had grown used to disappointment. At the same time, the arrival of the Polish Second Corps brought a renewed sense of momentum. These were soldiers hardened by exile, by marches across continents, by years of displacement. Their determination carried its own gravity. "We have climbed worse mountains," one private told his sergeant, tightening his belt before an evening drill. On the front lines, the change was felt in small encounters. Lieutenant John Macready, leading a night patrol, expected the usual hammer of machine gun fire when he neared a familiar ridge. Instead, he found a gap, a quiet pocket where no shots came. From higher up he heard German voices, not commanding but weary. His men exchanged looks they had never shared before, glimmers of possibility. "They're stretched," Macready whispered. "Finally stretched." Even the mountain's weather joined the shift. The thick winter fog that had shrouded German positions for weeks lifted more often, sunlight cut through ravines that had remained hidden. Allied aircraft, grounded so often by storms, returned to the skies for short, precise strikes that rattled the already strained defenders. Ironically, the rubble that once protected the Germans now began working against them. Narrow passages trapped them. Fallen blocks slowed movement between positions. Dust clouds rose with every impact, choking already exhausted lungs. The chaos that had once been their shield began turning into a cage. Private Henry Waskow, watching the ridge from a field station cot, wrote before being moved to the rear, "The hill looks tired, and the men holding it look just as tired." He captured something commanders later confirmed, that Cassino's defenders were nearing their limits. By early April, the slow shift had become undeniable. The paratroopers were stretched thin. The Allies were more organized, more patient, and closing in from multiple angles, the mountain no longer felt immortal. It felt as though it had finally begun to yield, stone by stone, to the men climbing toward its crown. When Monte Cassino finally fell in May 1944, the silence that followed felt heavier than the months of bombardment that had come before. The mountain, once crowned by the serene monastery, and later scarred into a fortress of shattered stone, seemed to exhale after holding its breath for nearly half a year. The German paratroopers who had resisted with astonishing resolve slipped away under cover of darkness, leaving behind positions that had become impossible to hold. When Allied patrols reached the summit, they found emptiness. No last stand, no final volley, only abandoned pockets of rubble and the cold wind moving through fractured walls. Polish Second Corps soldiers were the first to secure the ruins. Many fell to their knees, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. Some cried openly, not from joy, but from the release of months of tension and the memory of comrades who would never climb beside them again. On the lower slopes, New Zealand stretcher-bearers and Indian sappers moved silently among bodies caught between stones, their work slow and reverent. The losses were immense, scattered across the terraces like unwritten testimony. General Harold Alexander visited the summit 2 days later. He stood on a broken staircase overlooking the valley and said nothing for a long time. Reports were passed to him, casualty figures, final enemy counts, artillery expenditure, but he did not immediately look at them. Instead, he stared at the ruined abbey, the memory of what it once was flickering in the broken outlines. Allied commanders debated whether the destruction had been necessary. Whether the monastery's fall had helped or hindered the battle, no clear answer emerged. For the German defenders, the retreat marked the end of a defence fought with remarkable tenacity. Colonel Wilhelm Schrank marched his remaining men northward, many limping, some silent with shock. Before leaving the region, he looked back at the mountain, not in bitterness, but in quiet respect. "We held longer than we should have," he told a young corporal. "No shame in leaving a place that held us too." Civilians returned slowly, stepping through the ruins of the monastery with disbelief, searching for fragments of a world shattered beyond recognition. Abbot Gregorio Diamare wept as he crossed the former cloister, now open to the sky. He touched a surviving stone column and whispered, "This place will rise again." And in the valley, soldiers from every nation who had fought at Cassino walked among the wreckage with a heavy awareness that victory here had demanded more than anyone had ever imagined. The mountain was taken, the line was broken, but the cost lingered in every silence, every crater, every name written in a letter, tucked into a jacket that never returned home. When the guns finally fell silent over Monte Cassino, the mountain did not feel like a place won. It felt like a place endured. The ruins left behind carried no sense of triumph, only the weight of choices made under the pressure of war, and the lives that had been spent climbing toward a summit that seemed determined to resist every step. The monastery's shattered walls, once symbols of peace, became reminders of the impossible decisions that commanders faced, and the human cost paid by soldiers who had no voice in them. General Harold Alexander, standing among the rubble, understood that the victory at Cassino had not come from overwhelming force or flawless strategy. It had come from persistence, the quiet, stubborn refusal of thousands of men to turn back. Even when every inch of ground demanded a price, the Germans had fought with equal resolve, transforming the ruins into a fortress that held far longer than anyone predicted. Their defence, too, carried a tragic dignity, shaped by loyalty rather than ideology. The mountain had not belonged to one side or the other. It had belonged to the struggle itself. For the soldiers who survived, the memory of Cassino stayed not in the larger narrative of the Italian campaign, but in smaller, sharper fragments. The echo of boots on broken stones, the cries of wounded men carried by the wind, the letters tucked into pockets, the faces of friends who never reached the top. For many, the monastery became a symbol of the contradictions of war, a place destroyed to save lives, a sanctuary turned into a battlefield, a monument torn apart in the hope of ending suffering. In the end, Monte Cassino's meaning rested in a single truth. That victory sometimes arrives not with fanfare, but with exhausted men standing on ruins, unsure whether what they gained equals what was lost. The mountain fell, the path north opened, but the echoes of Cassino, the regret, the courage, the silence, lingered long after the last soldier walked down its slopes.